Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sonic Yoga's IG Live that happens weekly, Mondays, Eastern Standard Time, 12:30 p.m. I'm delighted to be here with you today. And we've titled this little broadcast, The Roots of Yoga. And the origin of it was Lauren Hanna, who is the founder of Sonic Yoga, and myself. I currently manage Sonic Yoga on her behalf, and I'm a senior teacher there. We decided that we were both actually feeling fairly troubled by the perception that yoga really is one thing, which is attending group classes and doing physical practice, and that's it. You've done your yoga, and that's what doing yoga means, and it's so much more than that. So when we talk about the roots of yoga, we're certainly talking about the origins of the practice itself. And we are also, though, looking to get into what are really the foundational tenets of a yoga practice. And asana, or the yoga postures, really are only a very small part of that. So what are the other parts? We've been going through week by week the 8 limbs of Patanjali's classical yoga structure. So these are 8 points, and the lowest 2 points are broken down into sub-points, if you will, or little subsections of practices. They're all practices. The practice of yoga, it's often called that anyway, right? The practice of yoga. Yoga is not an activity. Yoga is a state. Yoga practices are activities, but yoga is a state. So we are looking always to gain more awareness of this state and whether or not we are actually close to, or in fact being in that state of yoga, which is essentially means union or a yoking. So a union with what? A union with universal consciousness, or your fullest, most realized self. And I would argue that those are both really the same thing, which brings us neatly to today's topic, because we are talking about right now the niyamas. Now, the yamas, which we've been through already, are basically habits that you want to get rid of. You want to stop doing what would be framed as a bad habit by nearly anyone: stealing, lying, being dishonest, and being behaviors that are negative and harmful. So you want to first stop doing any behaviors that are negative and harmful, and then you want to elevate your behaviors, your actions from there. And today's topic is one of those elevated actions. So just to review the niyamas, which are the observances rather than the restraints, which are the yamas. Those are the habits we want to move past and get fully behind us. The niyamas are often framed as observances. Like, these are things that we're going to consciously, mindfully, intentionally do more and more day to day. And this is getting into what a yoga practice is really about. A yoga practice is something that actually happens every waking hour of every day. If you're a yogi, if you're considering yourself a yogi, really you're always practicing yoga, because it's all about, like, how are we responding to outside stimuli? How are we framing the conditions around us? And how are we letting those conditions play on our mind? And again, what's our reaction? Is it a positive reaction? Is it an elevated reaction? Or is it reactive in that it's simply, there's these outside stimuli that we're all going to experience, and we just get buffeted by them all the time, which is obviously a very stressful way of living, because we will feel, of course, that not only are we out of control of our circumstances, but that our circumstances could change anytime, and often we are starting to view those as like it's probably going to be negative. Like, we get used to current circumstances, and even if they're not so great, we get comfortable in them. So we often look at change as being something that we would be afraid of. Anyway, I'm getting a little off topic there. So the observances, in the order they're usually presented in are saucha, which is cleanliness; santosha, which is contentment as a practice, not as a result of conditions, but a practice of contentment. And you can go back on our reels and see all of these discussions if you're not sure like what it is I'm even really talking about here. And then we have tapas beyond that. Tapas is about a zeal, a zest for life, a fire, a determination, a drives, which we must have. And then today's topic is Svadyaya, which is translated as the study of self or self-study. And then the next one on top of that is a surrender to a higher force. Whoa, that is a doozy. That is a doozy. So that's coming next week, and hopefully Lauren will be able to join us, and we'll discuss that together, because man, that's something to unpack, isn't it? The surrender to a higher force, because that is certainly going to get into whether or not you even believe there's a higher force, or what your relationship is to the structures around the idea that there's a higher force, i.e. religion. So it's a doozy. We'll get into that next week, and it just keeps getting deeper and deeper, which is why we're so excited to be presenting these discussions to you. If you have any questions, ask your question. So Svadyaya is translated as the study of self. So the premise here is that we should be studying ourselves when we get into these elevated behaviors. We should engage in self-study. So as Westerners, probably most people listening to this call are from the West, and they have a Western, if you will, mindset. So in a Western mindset, self-study usually means self-analysis. And the most negative way to frame that might be that we're doing a lot of navel gazing. Like we're looking, if we study the self, it might mean we're getting really deep into like looking at like why we are the way we are, what conditions through our childhood led to us to behave and believe the way we behave and believe currently. So there's certainly a positive connotation to self-study in that context, because we're going to learn about ourselves in a way which is framed around, again, experience and influence of conditions that we know to be familiar to us, and that we, I think, also will know to be tangibly true. They're the circumstances that we grew up in and the conditions around us in our environment right now. And so we, in the Western mindset, are studying the way we move through all of that, the way we react to it, why, and trying to maybe unwind a few things that happened to us long ago in our past, which caused us to sort of like always react in a certain way, and maybe we want to stop doing that. So we get into self-analysis, right? So the idea of Svadyaya, which is much more from an Eastern mindset, of course, as its origins are in India. Self-study is really a matter of getting very, very quiet, which is not so easy to do, getting really, really, really quiet, ideally quieting the mind and looking inward and getting to know the self in, I think, perhaps a more positive light. So rather than our behaviors and our attitudes, which are current, we're looking deep within ourselves to see what is our essence, our true essence, which is a concept that I'm endlessly fascinated by. I think that's probably the reason I got so deeply into yoga, because I was wondering like who I am, if there's a way to answer that question, without the conditions you grew up in. So I always frame it like this, like, let's say we removed your name and where you were from, where you were born, who your parents were, what they taught you, the things that you saw growing up. What if we took all of that away? Would there be nothing left? Of course not. What would be left would be your essence, yourself that somehow knows. And we could call that intuition, right? Like, how do we know things? How do we see into the future sometimes, essentially? We know that something is so, and we know that it's probably going to happen in a certain way. And if we only trusted that, we would probably be in a much better place. This is getting close to the idea of like, what is your essence? Who are you without the outside influences that you've essentially put up barriers around yourself to often survive those outside influences and persevere through those outside influences? Like who would you be without all of that stuff? So that is the matter of self-study, to look inward and to find essence. Now, still though, why would we be involved in self-study? Why would we be engaged in it? There's still a point that's very, very specific, if you will. So in yoga philosophy broadly, there are many branches of yoga philosophy, but broadly speaking, yoga philosophy is suggesting that the better you get to know yourself, the more you know everything. The more you know yourself, the more you know others around you. The more you know yourself, the more connected you are to universal consciousness. So it's a looking inward, but not in the negative sense of getting into navel gazing and being obsessed with yourself, which means really you're actually kind of obsessed with your identity, your name, who you think you are because of what you've studied, what you've achieved. All of that is identity. We're talking about the self without all of those layers of things that are really of a very specific and very short frame of time. You know, again, where you grew up, what your name is, and what your family name is, and what are the sort of like ramifications of that, or what are the influences of that. All of that is identity. If you stripped all that away, what would you be left with? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about yoga philosophy and the study of self. So the premise is, the more you look within, the more you are getting connected to everything around you, to consciousness itself, universal consciousness, which in yoga philosophy is a premise that I guess, you know, if you're new to it or just sort of curious about yoga, you might have to a degree accept that the premise that there is a universal consciousness is possible. This is getting into defining really all things, like some people would call what I'm talking about God, actually. Like that's a very common way of perceiving what universal consciousness could mean. Others might frame it a completely different way and say, you know, perhaps we might say there's no single God who's an old man in the clouds with a beard, but there is a unifying consciousness that we're all connected to and all actually aware of to some degree. And where does the possibility even of that awareness come from? Actually, the possibility of that awareness is teased into us every time we go to sleep. Every time you get into a deep REM sleep and your mind starts to operate in a way where it's sort of independent of our conscious control. It's just doing what it's going to do, and we call that the dream state often. Like, this is really the area where we're getting into a connectivity to everything around us and an awareness of everything around us that often is eluding us day to day, because day to day we're all probably in survival mode, aren't we? We have a job, we have responsibilities, we have people in our lives that we feel responsible for. We feel like we have to tend to them, be there for them, etc. Plus we have to have a job, or we have to be looking for a job. All of those things are probably what feels like are right in front of our faces that we always have to do. Point is, we can find ourselves with very little time, or feel like we have very little time to even spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes in a state of true quiet peace, absent of thought. So that's meditation, of course. So self-study, the way it's actually defined in yoga in terms of like, what would you do? What would you actually do to get into self-study? It's not so much analysis as it is being very, very, very quiet so that your thoughts slow way, way down and you're able to start to look within. And in addition to that, it actually means the study of yoga texts, the repetition of mantra, because these practices are meant to draw us into deeper and deeper awareness. We could flip it around and say that if we're studying text and we're reciting a mantra, which is something that was either given to us by a teacher or suggested by a text, that's taking us into awareness of things that are outside of us. But if we're taking our awareness into things that are outside of us related to universal consciousness, that's going to bring us into an awareness of what's happening deep within us. Just as if we simply decide we're going to look within, truly simply look within and be as quiet as possible for a little while and be still, stillness in body and ultimately stillness in mind, that way of looking within will bring us more and more into an awareness of everything around us. And so that gets into the idea of, okay, so I still have to live my life. So what do you mean? What am I going to do? So hopefully we're going to try to sit in meditation for a few moments each day. We could also engage in breathing exercises, which are often today referred to as breath work, but breath work refers actually to pranayama. That's been around forever. Breath work is not this new thing that is kind of seen as a fad. It's been around for an extremely long time. There's just a new, more palatable name for it. So meditation, breath work, study of texts that are pointing toward how to get into this state of yoga. These are things you can do, but also you have to go about your life, don't you? You have to wake up in the morning and get dressed and do stuff that you're supposed to do and do stuff that you would want to do because you choose to do it, because you realize the importance of doing those things. You realize the importance of the people in your life that you're trying to be there for. You also realize the importance of upholding a way to make a living. So again, you can actually sustain yourself to a degree that you can help others and be there for others. That's really, at the end of the day, what it's hopefully about, right? So you have to do all those things. In doing all of those things, I think we find that we interact with a lot of people, right? And so one of the things I think we should be more and more understanding as we get into the idea of like practicing yoga, which is much more expansive an activity than just showing up to a yoga class or doing a yoga class from YouTube or something. If we're going to start to practice yoga, I think one of the things we should start to do is go about our day and make eye contact with people that we are interacting with, and see by looking into those people's eyes that you are in there. Like you look in someone else's eyes and you start to recognize yourself, because what you're really recognizing is the connectivity and the absolute union between everyone around you. There's a branch of yoga philosophy which I'm particularly interested in, which suggests that everything you see, everyone you see, is really a reflection of yourself. So if you're disturbed by someone's behavior, rather than looking at them and saying like, why are you doing that? That's this bad behavior and it's upsetting me. The more elevated way of looking at someone else's bad behavior is to say, that's some aspect of me that is being reflected back on me. And why is that? You know, what is it in my belief system that I'm adhering to? What is it in my attitudes that I have allowed to become my habits in terms of the way I'm thinking? What is it that is causing this thing to come at me seemingly from the outside and be so jarring or so upsetting? That's a very elevated practice, I think, of self-study, is to look at others and to see it as a reflection of you. And so anything, especially that you might find somewhat troubling in others' behavior, instead of judging them for that behavior, you again turn within and look inward and ask yourself, why is that behavior presenting itself to me? Why is that thing kind of coming at me? And what can I do about it? Because I see that it's coming at me. That must be somehow about myself. Yeah? So the real practice of yoga, or the real attempt to practice yoga, is to again and again and again and again put the responsibility of all things around you in your own lap. You know, which is very, I think it's a tough thing to accept, and I think it can almost make us feel more isolated rather than more connected, because instead of seeking help from someone else, or deciding that something that someone else did is their responsibility and their problem, and you're going to brush it off and stuff like that, you keep putting it back in your lap. And so in doing so, where can you turn for help, or where can you turn for support? It almost sounds like what you're really doing is you continue to turn inward, so there is no help, there is no support, you only have yourself, which I think is true. But the thing is, the more we realize the more we put these things back into our lap and make it an opportunity for self-examination, the more we feel connected to all the fellow travelers around us. The thing that I've found since I've been teaching yoga for almost 15 years now is that I find everywhere, absolutely everywhere, all kinds of people who think in similar ways that I've been thinking. They're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. Most people are getting through their day, doing what they have to do, and aside from that, at some level of their consciousness, even if it's underneath the fact that they're watching a TV show or reading something on the internet or doing the dishes or whatever, they're thinking, what else is there? Why do I keep finding myself unable to grab onto this thread that I can feel is out there? And that's really, I think, what the practice of yoga is about. It's about recognizing that there's this thread and just grabbing onto it and holding onto it. But then I think what you find, if you do that, if you even sort of like allow your imagination to consider that might be possible, when you've grabbed onto that thread, you find that there's all these other people ahead of you and behind you who are holding the same thread, and you don't feel alone at all. So anyway, that's my little spiel on Svadyaya, which is self-study, a matter of self-examination, so that we get to the next state, which we're going to be talking about next week, which is surrender to a higher power. I mean, this is really like crazy stuff, because everything I just said and everything that seemingly is being said about self-study, does it support or does it contradict the idea of surrendering to a higher power? Very interesting way to bend your mind when you look at these things. But that is the practice of yoga. Yoga practice is not about buying $150 pants and a $95 top and a $150 mat and going to a fancy studio, laying it down on the hardwood floor and practicing with other people. That practice has been around for like 5 minutes compared to the entire span of the practice of yoga being known and being recorded, being acknowledged. That's about 5,000 years. And that practice is always turning around meditation. Always, always, always turning around meditation. And meditation can seem kind of like an esoteric practice, I think, even though it should be really, really simple. The simplest techniques to get into meditation, or the simplest techniques to attempt to get into meditation, are almost always, I think, the superior techniques. When we get into a lot of heavily guided meditations, what we're doing, I think, is saying, I can't do that myself. I can't do it. I need someone to guide me. I need someone's voice. I need to hear someone's voice telling me what to do. It's very, very helpful in the beginning to be guided through a meditation. But I think we do have to guard ourselves into being seduced into feeling like that's the only way to get into meditation, and becoming tethered to that way of getting into meditation, which means downloading an app on your phone and listening to, some guidance. It's okay. There are certainly worse ways you can be spending your time. But I always think that what we should be doing instead is really trusting our own innate abilities we were born with, abilities that existed in us before we were born. And we should turn off all the lights and turn off all the sounds and get away from all the machines that are doing various things in our houses, and close our eyes and sit and just get in touch with your breath. Whatever that means to you, that's pretty much what I mean. But if you need a further explanation, you can hear your own breath if you get really quiet. You can use your imagination and visualize your breath moving through your body. It's such a simple thing, and it seems like perhaps how's that going to really get me anywhere into understanding why I'm here and what's happening around me and where is it all going? But the mind is working in a certain way where it's almost like the mind is out of our control. We're very reliant on our intellect. We are taught, especially in the West, to keep developing the intellect. More and more education, more and more learning is always a good thing. And it is a good thing, obviously. But what happens is we see the intellect as the thing that's driving us through our life. But the intellect can really get in our way and really twist things up without us even realizing it. The intellect should simply be a tool, however developed, however sharp. The intellect should be a tool for our intuition. That's what's going on, right? So if you are sitting quietly, often, meaning try to do it every day, even if you do it for 5 minutes. Try to do it every day, even if you do it for 10 minutes. Just don't have expectations. Try not to judge what's happening and how well it's going. Just sit quietly in observance of your breath. This, I think, is the most basic practice of a self-study. You can from then get into mantra, Om, that's a mantra. Soham, that's an extremely simple mantra, maybe the best mantra for what we're talking about here. You would just repeat again and again, so hum, so hum, so hum. And you can see that happening through the inhale and the exhale, inhaling so, exhaling hum, things like that. But I don't even think it needs to necessarily be that complicated when you're starting. Sit quietly. Decide that an examination of the self through simply trying to get quiet enough to look into the self is worth your time. Is it worth it to stand next to a body of water and look down through the body of water, having noticed that the surface is clear enough that you can actually see below the surface? Is it worth it to just stand by the side of that body of water and stare down into it as deep as you can? Is it worth it? Oh my gosh, it's an incredible experience, isn't it? We all know that. So there's a similar experience available in looking within with our eyes simply closed and listening to the breath. So if we visualize our consciousness, the state of our consciousness currently as a pond, and by thinking and by trying to control events around us, we're skipping stones across the pond and we're seeing all of the ripples and we're kind of transfixed by the ripples themselves and the act of skipping the stones. If we stop skipping the stones and we just stare at the body of water as it becomes more and more still, and then we look underneath the surface, that's essentially what's happening when you meditate. When you start to attempt to meditate, you'll experience the stones being skipped across the surface. So you'll only be looking at the surface. You'll be having your thoughts and processing everything through the thoughts that you're having. The more time, the more into the habit you get of sitting quietly, the more the thoughts are going to slow down. There's going to be more space between the thoughts. And you can start to recognize that you can just let the thought pass by you. It's going to come up, but just let it keep going by you. In other words, what we're usually doing throughout our day is having the same set of thoughts over and over again. The same things keep rolling around in our heads again and again. It's actually very repetitive. So you know you can get back to that stuff later when you're trying to sit for meditation. You can return to it later. It's going to be there. So when a thought comes up when you're trying to sit quietly, you just let it keep going and you just return your attention to the way the breath is moving through you. Try it and tell me how wrong I was next week, okay? Okay, my name is Keith. This is Sonic Yoga. This is Back to the Roots Conversation. This will be available on Reels forever. If you missed it, if you want to hear it again, if you caught us on the end, just look on our Reels later and it will always be there. I'll be back next week, I hope, with the founder of Sonic Yoga, Lauren Hanna, and we'll get into the concept of surrendering to a higher power. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Bye.